BiomedRx Optimum Woman is the only woman's high-potency full-spectrum multiple vitamin supplement to contain 56 nutrients, including those most important for today's woman, such as calcium for bone health, iron for healthy red blood cells, beta-carotene, biotin for nail and hair health, gamma-linoleic acid from evening primrose oil, octasanol, grapeseed extract, a potent antioxidant important for maintaining capillary strength, and vegetarian digestive enzyme. Visit www.biomedrxsupplements.com.
Gold label quality BiomedRx CBD oil is made from organic hemp that is locally grown, glyphosate-free, gluten-free, non-GMO, homogenized, third-party tested, and CO2 extracted. Visit www.biomedrxcbd.com.
Hi, this is Devin Lockett, the president of JobSite Route. As the son of a general contractor, I know how difficult it can be to get good food on the job site. And letting your construction workers leave the job site to buy lunch just takes valuable time away from them being on the site. I've developed an app and a program that will bring a steady stream of food trucks to your job sites every month for the low price of only $100 per month per site. That comes up to about $3 per day to have a steady stream of food trucks coming to your job sites all day, every working day. You can also contact the food trucks ahead of time and pre-order your food from the menu on our app. This saves valuable time for your construction workers and for you. It also sends a variety of delicious food served on Southern California food trucks to your job sites all day. When you think about it, it only makes sense to join the JobSite Route Network.
Yeah, just doing a little mic check, checking my levels here. How's everyone doing this morning? You know, I just want to take you guys with me on a brief journey exploring the political idea of Georgism, okay? And I just started learning about Georgism, but the more I examine it, the more it seems to make sense, and it seems to be a theory that can solve a lot of our political problems. Not to mention, it's something that is in practice right now around the world, successfully in Singapore and many other countries. I think one of the things that we should first understand about implementing Georgism before we get started, before we even start to watch these videos that I'm going to show you this morning, before we even get started, one of the things that I really wanted to stress is that this would be great if we implemented it in the United States while making sure that land in the United States can only be sold to and owned by American citizens, which is something that is understood and within the legal structure in many countries of the world, most countries of the world, in fact. So with that being said, I'm not going to keep delaying everyone. Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. We're going to transition. All right, so Georgism 101.
The air we breathe is naturally occurring, necessary for life, and available to everyone, regardless of race, gender, social class, politics, or country of origin. Nobody should have to pay to breathe air, because nobody invented air. Sounds reasonable, right? So why can't the same be said for land? Land, like the air, is natural, necessary for life, available to everyone, and invented by nobody. So why do you pay to live on it? Assuming you do pay, given YouTube's demographics and the current housing market, you probably pay rent to a landlord instead of owning your own home. But anyway, seeing as though land is just as natural as air, why should people be allowed to wall some of it off and charge you to live on it? It'd be like owning a patch of air. This is the philosophy of Henry George, an American economist who lived from 1839 to 1897. Henry George saw that a lot of people were getting really rich off extracting value from the land, whether it be through being a landlord or from mining. Surely, as nobody invented land, it should equally belong to all members of society, like the air we breathe. If you want to live on the land, wall it off and call it your home, you should expect the rest of society to respect that. Therefore, you should pay a tax on the value of the land you are trying to claim to pay for that protection from society. Because other people now don't have access to the land, they should be compensated for it. Land in the big cities is worth a lot, and landowners there will be taxed more. But land in the middle of nowhere is worth very little, so farmers won't be affected all too much. Henry George believed that a land value tax should be implemented on all land across the United States and replace all other taxes, like income tax or tariffs on imports. After the wealth was used to fund the government, whatever was left from that tax is to be shared out to society in the form of a citizen's dividend. This solves 4 problems he believed was hindering progress and keeping people in poverty. Number 1, income taxes. People would no longer need to give away what they have worked hard to earn to pay for the work of the government. Only the rich landowners would pay for services. 2, landlords. As the land value is now no longer determined by the landlord, landlords cannot artificially inflate the value of the land in order to make a profit. The position of landlord will eventually fade from existence. People will be allowed to move freely from place to place without the possibility of rising rents impeding on someone's decision to move. Georgists also support the socialization of public transport like railroads, allowing free movement of people. Number 3, debt. Whatever is left of the land value tax revenue after the government is fully funded should be split up and given back to the people equally. This means that those poor in society benefit more from the citizens' dividend. 4, inefficiency. Landowners who simply sit on the land without using it will still have to pay the land value tax, and as they aren't making money off this land, there will be more of an incentive to sell the land to whoever is willing to buy it and make better use of it. Every single major economist, from Smith to Mill, from Keynes to Friedman, believed that land value tax was the most efficient and fair form of taxation. All these economists observed that taxing people's income or labour deterred them from earning more or working harder. However, taxing land value did not deter people from owning and improving land. This land value tax also extends to the oceans and the air, so polluters have to pay for destroying people's collective property. But how would you determine the value of the air, the land and the ocean? Land value tax is a progressive tax based on the unimproved value of the land. Businesses are regularly assessed for their value by the government anyway, so why not do the same for land? A land value inspector could be a good job for all those landlords you just put out of business. Georgism was immensely popular in the 1800s and early 1900s, with Henry George's manifesto, Progress and Poverty, being the best-selling book of the era. Every single progressive leader in the USA until the 1940s was influenced by the book. But despite containing the idea of socializing all the land and abolishing landlords, Georgism is firmly based in liberalism, where a free market exists and a government to enforce those rights. Henry George rejected the label socialist. Today, Georgism is worked on and contributed by liberal, libertarian, conservative, socialist, and anarchist economists and philosophers, all sides joining forces to create one centrist liberal system. Beautiful. Since the 1940s, Georgism has been mostly dormant aside from a mention in an episode of The Andy Griffith Show, but since the financial crash and the annihilation of the housing market, ideas like land value tax and universal income have all come back into the public view in an attempt to solve the crisis. Most modern Georgists don't think that a land value tax should completely replace every form of taxation revenue. That would be impossible. Instead, ideas vary from using it to replace property tax, VAT, or income tax. It all depends on how progressive the tax is. This theorizing is all well and good, but are there any examples of land value tax at work? Well, yes. Unlike other radical solutions, Georgism has been tried and is successful. In Singapore, probably the most famous case, all of the land is owned by the government, and those with valuable land pay up to 16% of that value in tax. In fact, land is so efficiently used in Singapore that homelessness is virtually non-existent, and most homeless people sleep rough to avoid the morning traffic, which is a whole other issue. Denmark has a 3% tax on all land worth over $343,000, which seems low but still encourages efficient use of the land. Detroit in the 1890s had a land value tax, which is what originally enticed Henry Ford to build his motorcar factory there. And lastly, Taiwan, headed by the Georgist Kuomintang Party from 1928 to 2000, still uses land value tax today. Very important when you have such limited space. So there you have it. Georgism is the philosophy where all land belongs equally to society, and those who want to claim ownership of it should be expected to pay the rest of the community to respect that domain. What is earned is kept, and what is unearned is shared.
That's pretty interesting. We're going to watch a few more here, okay? Just a few more that may explain it a little bit more in depth.
So, tell me about your bond.
Yeah, she's the first one to email me on my birthday every year.
This video is sponsored in part by Fabulous. Do you know who this man is? You probably don't, but he was once considered one of the most influential Americans in history. One journalist called him, quote, the most famous American economic writer, and, quote, author of a book which probably had a larger worldwide circulation than any other work on economics ever written. Well, more on this man and the book he wrote in a few seconds, but first, let's go to a random field. Oh, hey. I'm Mr. Beat, and I'm just sitting here in a random field touching grass. The man you saw in that picture, his name was Henry George, and the book, which ended up selling millions, is called, make sure I get this right, Progress and Poverty, an inquiry into the cause of industrial depressions and of increase of wants with increase of wealth, the remedy. Goodness, what a title that is. A title so long that I lost my train of thought. Where am I? Why am I sitting in a random field? Oh, I remember. So I previously released a video about every major type of tax. Oh, there's that video now. You better hurry up and catch it before it's gone. It's gone. Anyway. In that video, I said there is a tax called the single tax by the legendary Henry George. I'm going to make a future video about this, but I think the single tax on land is something worth reconsidering again. The more I learn about it, the more I like it. Well, this is that future video, okay? And actually, I should have been more specific. Henry George's single tax, the only tax that he believed should exist, was a land value tax. To help me explain it, let's bring in an economist and fellow YouTuber, Jacob Clifford.
Thanks, Mr. Beat. I appreciate it. Thank you all very much. A land value tax is a tax on unimproved land. So just the land, not any buildings or improvements. And that's one of the reasons that makes it...
Before he goes into more details about a land value tax, let me tell you who this Henry George fellow was. After all, if you're watching this, you probably don't know anything about Henry George, even though he used to be kind of a big deal.
Fair use.
Henry George was born in Philadelphia on September 2nd, 1839, the second of 10 children. His dad, Richard George, published religious books and was a devout Episcopalian. Henry was, not so much. His dad forced him to go to the Episcopal Academy, but he hated it there, eventually dropping out. That didn't mean he didn't enjoy learning, though. He convinced his dad to hire him a tutor, and he still read a bunch, and even attended lectures at the Franklin Institute. For fun! He was particularly into economics. He read Adam Smith and David Ricardo. By the time he was 15, Henry had realized his parents were barely scraping by to feed the family, and he knew if he wanted to make some money, he must go out on his own. So he traveled the world as a cabin boy on a ship, which means he basically took care of the captain's needs. He got paid $6 a month. Instead of returning to Philadelphia after he got done working at sea, he went to San Francisco to first potentially seek gold, but after that was a bust, he worked as a typesetter, a weigher in a rice mill, and a farm laborer. The job he kept coming back to was typesetter, though. Unfortunately, Henry rarely made much money. When he was 21, he met Annie Fox, an orphaned immigrant from Australia, and the two fell in love. Annie's uncle, who had been her guardian after her grandma died, didn't appreciate how poor Henry was, though, and didn't approve of the relationship, but they secretly got married anyway. Despite a happy marriage, the couple did struggle financially. Even though they couldn't afford to feed them, they had 4 kids together. Henry George Jr., who later became a United States representative and wrote a biography about his father, Richard, Jenny, and Anna. Following the birth of Richard, times were so tough for the Georges that Henry often had to beg for food. He later recalled one story, quote, "I walked along the street and made up my mind to get money from the first man whose appearance might indicate that he had it to give. I stopped a man, a stranger, and told him I wanted $5. He asked what I wanted it for. I told him that my wife was confined and that I had nothing to give her to eat. He gave me the money. If he had not, I think I was desperate enough to have killed him." Things began to turn for the better when Henry realized he wanted to be a writer in 1865. By that time, he had steady printing work for the newly created San Francisco Times and began writing political editorials for local newspapers. Even though Henry never went to college and had no formal training, his editorials became quite popular, and due to this, he got promotions at the Times. By the summer of 1867, he was the managing editor. In 1868, he left the Times to become managing editor of the bigger San Francisco Chronicle. Soon after that, he wrote his most influential article up to that point, called "What the Railroad Will Bring Us." It was a response to the first transcontinental railroad being completed, and while most everybody was excited about it, Henry was a bit more cynical, writing that the railroad would only benefit some people. He argued the railroad would kill small towns and small businesses while propping up already great cities and already huge corporations. Keep in mind that this was an 1868. decades before the populist movement. Henry's popularity as a writer only grew after that. While he passionately called for future populist reforms like the secret ballot, public ownership of certain natural monopolies, and the right to vote for women, he also thought free trade was way better than protectionism. Very nice. And he dabbled in politics, running for the California State Assembly, but was handily defeated by the, you guessed it, railroad industry. As Henry's editorials grew more popular, his family finally got out of poverty, but Henry wouldn't constantly stop thinking about poverty for the rest of his life. He had two aha moments that are literally the reason why I am making a video about him and his ideas today. The first happened in 1868 when he traveled to New York City. He was struck by the fact that those in poverty in such a great city with great wealth were apparently a lot worse off than those in poverty back home in California, a place with much less development. The second aha moment happened one day in 1870 when Henry sat on his horse overlooking San Francisco Bay after a dude told him that an seemingly unimportant acre of farmland nearby would sell for $1,000. Quote, like a flash it came over me that there was the reason of advancing poverty with advancing wealth. With the growth of population, land grows in value, and the men who work it must pay more for the privilege. Soon, Henry wrote his first analysis of what he called the land question. In 1871, Henry helped found the San Francisco Daily Evening Post, and he became its editor. This is when many first became exposed to his land value tax idea. However, he accumulated lots of debt with the Evening Post, and his family ended up in dire poverty again. Fortunately for Henry, by 1876, he was now a minor celebrity and began giving speeches. He also still made some money as a freelancer of sorts. On September 18, 1877, he began to write his masterpiece book. The one I told you about earlier, you know, with the long title? Yeah, that's the one. We'll just call it Progress and Poverty from here on out. He finished the book in March 1879 and supposedly dropped to the floor and wept like a baby after completing it late one night. That sounds a bit dramatic, but maybe it happened. Anyway, by this time, he and his family were living in New York City, and that is where Progress and Poverty got published in 1880. And keep in mind, at this time, he was 40 years old. That's my age. Well, the book didn't sell that well at first, but slowly but surely, thanks to word of mouth, it began to catch on, as did Henry George's reputation. He promoted the book in Europe, spreading his solution for eradicating poverty and reducing extreme wealth inequality. Yep, the world was learning about his single tax on the value of land to completely replace the taxes the workers paid on their income and the taxes the owners paid on their capital. Little did he know.
I've written papers on Little Did He Know. I used to teach a class based on Little Did He Know. I mean, I once gave an entire seminar on Little Did He Know.
That he would literally ignite a gigantic social movement that was a major catalyst of not just the populist movement, but the entire progressive era. Progress and Poverty sold millions of copies and eventually made Henry George a household name. And apparently at the peak of the book's popularity, and I read this from many sources, Henry George was the third most famous man in the United States, right behind Thomas Edison and Mark Twain, of course. George's idea of a single land value tax became ridiculously popular.
Actually, can I jump in here?
Well, of course, Mr. Clifford.
Okay, great. A land value tax is more efficient than other types of taxes. Taxes influence decisions. If we tax cigarettes, that's going to decrease smoking, which is good. But if you tax things that society actually wants, that's going to decrease their consumption and production. And that leads to something that economists call deadweight loss. Inefficient markets that are not producing the quantity that society actually wants or needs. But since the supply of land is fixed, a land tax doesn't decrease its production. It doesn't cause deadweight loss. So sales taxes and excise taxes and even income taxes and corporate taxes can slow down the economy by discouraging production. But George argued that a single land tax would actually encourage and promote economic activity by discouraging people from hoarding land or just holding it for speculation. If you own huge tracts of unimproved, valuable land, a land tax will encourage you to either improve the land or sell it to somebody else that's going to improve the land by building houses or farms or factories or something else that'll generate enough money to pay for the tax. So in the end, all that land is used extremely efficiently, and the land tax means there's tax revenue for the government to provide public goods and services. And George argued that that might be enough to provide universal basic income.
Well, thanks, Mr. Clifford. Oh, hey, everyone, be sure to check out his YouTube channel. His videos were the main videos I had my students watch when I taught econ in the classroom.
Wait, you really forced your students to watch me?
It's true. Anyway, in Progress and Poverty, George argued that a single land value tax was needed because most of the wealth created by social and technological advances in an industrial free market economy was actually owned by landowners. And many of those landowners had monopolies over markets through something called economic rent. Economic rent is basically income gained from controlling a limited resource. So even though these landowners did nothing to improve the land value, they still got the profit. And remember, this was land, a natural resource. It was there already. These landowners didn't create it. They were just benefiting from something they did nothing to help create nor improve. In Progress and Poverty, George argued the game was rigged, and the only way to fix the game was not to tax the worker on what they earn, because that would disincentivize them from working, and not to tax the owner of capital through taxes on what they own or buy, because that would disincentivize them from investing. To George, land was common property, and everyone was entitled to it. But that doesn't mean he was a Marxist, though. Oh no. George was a Georgist. George was fine with capitalism. He just wasn't a fan of rigged capitalism, in which the landowners were essentially parasites. Because he thought everyone was entitled to the land, many of George's followers hesitated to even call a land value tax a tax. They preferred to call it basically rent paid to society in exchange for getting to exclusively use the land for whatever they wanted, while also compensating for the fact that others couldn't use it. By the way, George's followers soon became known as Georgists, and George's whole economic ideology became known as Georgism. Anyway, George's book and ideas became so popular that governments around the world got rid of all taxes. And that's why today we only have a land use tax. And we all lived happily ever after. The end.
Yeah, right. I wish. We all wish.
Except no. No, not at all. What I just said, I was just making that up. You see, people who owned land, and this may be a bit surprising to you, didn't like the idea of a land value tax. Go figure, huh? Many people like the fact that they could just let land sit there and it would automatically go up in value. In 1886, Henry once again gave politics an old try when he was recruited by the United Labor Party to run for mayor of New York City. However, he was up against the machine, aka the establishment. Okay, Tammany Hall, the powerful political organization that essentially controlled New York politics. Tammany Hall feared that if George won the election, politics in the city might be reorganized along class lines instead of ethnic lines, which is where Tammany got its power. Tammany Hall called George's supporters, quote, anarchists, nihilists, communists, and socialists. Well, George lost the election, but he surprised many with a strong second-place finish. Not only that, but there is some evidence that voter fraud may have been involved. Just saying. His supporters were not even allowed to oversee the ballot count. Regardless, he did finish ahead of an obscure dude by the name of Theodore Roosevelt, and despite losing the election for the rest of his life, George's popularity only continued to grow. In 1897, he ran for mayor of New York City again, but just 4 days before the election, he suffered a fatal stroke that shocked the nation. His death made international headlines, and possibly as many as 200,000 people showed up to view his body. At the time of his death, Henry George was the most well-known economist around, and Georgism was arguably at its peak. And yet, I only learned about George and Georgism like 3 years ago. And as I researched for this video, I noticed that the man and his land value tax idea are more obscure than goat cheese on pizza. Why is that? Why did Georgism go out of style?
Why did Georgism go out of style, huh?
Well, first of all, in his later years, George was too much of a purist. He often refused to compromise on his ideals with other progressive reformers. Other progressive reformers didn't like how he was still okay with almost all capital existing, and how he rejected a strong role for government. They didn't like his opposition to public ownership of certain types of infrastructure, his support of free trade, and him being a gradualist versus trying to start a radical revolution. Overall, he frustrated fellow progressive reformers by not shutting up about a land value tax, thinking that was the only thing that could solve everybody's problems. But of course, there were also the landowners and the speculators. Even today, much wealth is earned through owning land, and a land value tax threatens that. But more importantly, land speculators have tremendous power over the government and the media, and they would simply not get to make money anymore with a land value tax. Now, there are other reasons why Georgism faded out in the 1900s. World War I really hurt its momentum, for starters. Another big thing that is probably not brought up enough by Georgists is that cars got way more popular during the century so that people could more easily travel longer distances to get to their land. Simply put, being able to get around more easily increased the amounts of land available. See all this urban sprawl? That's because of cheaper land out on the fringes of metropolitan areas. And that's a big reason why Georgism became somewhat obsolete. Landowners have also been somewhat successful at other reforms to help the poor, like welfare, which, wouldn't you know it, also helps them out, because this also helps their land value go up. But here I am on land in 2022, and there's been a renewed interest in Henry George and Georgism, especially with the younger folks online. What's up with that? Well, despite urban sprawl continuing to be a thing, land prices keep rising sharply, to a point now where many young folks are priced out, stuck as renters, maybe forever. The dream of owning a home to build up wealth is slowly fading away. So young folks are like, screw it. Let's revisit this land value tax idea again. You might be thinking, well, Mr. Beat, if a land value tax is so great, why isn't there any place in the world that does it? And my response is, there are places in the world where they do it. It's not what Henry George envisioned, but variations of a land value tax exist around the world in places like Estonia, Singapore, Denmark, Taiwan, and even in parts of the United States. However, for a land value tax to truly be effective, it must be widespread. Otherwise, those not having to pay a land value tax will have an even bigger advantage. And if a land value tax was ever widely implemented, it likely just couldn't happen overnight. It would be incredibly unfair in the short term to property owners who paid a lot for their land, as many of them would likely see their land lose its value over time with a land value tax. What's fascinating to me is that Georgism politically isn't left-wing or right-wing. It's actually a good balance that unites liberty and equality. The more I learn about it, the more impressed I am with it. which is why it will never happen.
Well, that was very informative and one man's view. Let's check this out.
What kinds of keywords are the most popular? Ensure that you understand the latest search.
In the late 1800s, Henry George was trying to solve a great problem. The tax system of the United States was broken. You see, the two largest taxes in Western society are income tax and VAT tax. The problem here is that income tax decentralizes work by taking people's hard-earned wages, and VAT tax makes all the products that we buy more expensive. The problem has been debated for ages, with right-wing politicians fighting for lower taxes and left-wing politicians fighting for higher taxes. But Henry George was smarter than that. Instead of trying to reduce taxes, which would have ended in a political stalemate, he tried to solve the problem in a more nuanced way. He proposed that all taxes should be removed and instead be replaced by only one tax, and he called this the single tax system. But which tax would replace all the other taxes? And why would this tax be any better? Well, there's one tax that we know of which actually increases productivity, and that is land value tax. Land value tax is a monthly fee paid by landowners based on the value of the land they own. Now, this elegant tax system gained a great following and ended up becoming so popular that it led to an entirely new economic ideology called Georgism. Since then, several of history's greatest thinkers have supported this ideology, and if you go to the Wikipedia article on Georgism, you will find that this ideology has been supported not only by economists, but also by businessmen, politicians, and scientists like Albert Einstein, Winston Churchill, and Henry Ford. The fact remains, however, that the tax system has not improved at all, and the single tax system remains a great solution for an old problem. Therefore, today's video is going to cover the three main reasons why Georgists believe that land value taxes should replace the current system.
Reason number one, the current tax system is broken. Wealth that is created by private individuals is not given back to private individuals, it is given back to society. And on the other hand, wealth that is generated by society is not given back to society, but given back to private landowners. And why do we find this system to be fair? Why do we find it okay to tax people on wealth that they produce themselves, but we don't find it okay to tax people on wealth that they've received simply because of something that society has paid for? So a real life example of this is, if you look behind me, here you'll see a train station. And if you have a piece of land and the society builds a train station close to your land, here you have an example of a land that grows in value, not because of something that the private landowner has done, but because of something that society has built. Reason number two, land value taxes are the only form of tax that actually incentivizes productivity. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, let's take a look at some classical tax examples. To begin with, let's assume that you increase the tax on wages and on income. Now, what will happen with the workers? Well, they will get less money out of every hour they put into their job. And so naturally, some workers will work less, and therefore there will be a reduction in the number of hours being worked by employees. Another example could be with regards to investments. Here it could be people putting their money into corporations, into startups, into green energy, into whatnot. Again, in this scenario, let's say we increase the tax on investments. Again, what will happen is that since people will get less out of the money that they invest, they will also be less likely to invest. And therefore, again, we will see a reduction in the number of investments being made. Finally, if we go to the third example, which is a tax on land. Again, we increase the tax on land and ask ourselves, what is going to happen? Well, if you, as a landowner, own a piece of land, then you will either be faced with two options. Either you'll want to sell your land because now, because of the tax, you will have to pay a monthly tax. So in order to avoid a loss, you'll want to sell the land, or alternatively, you will want to use the land to produce value in order to counteract this loss. And so in this scenario, you will actually have an increase in productivity. The thing about land is that the more expensive it is, the more you encourage landowners to utilize the land as effectively as possible. This building right behind me is a good example of that. As you can see, the apartments extend out over the road, meaning that inside there's actually more livable square meters available. Obviously, land value taxes might not be the reason why this building is built in such a way, but the principle certainly holds true that the higher the tax is, the better each piece of land will be utilized. Think of this also from a societal point of view. In the end, the higher tax on land could actually mean that there would be more livable square meters available inside a big city. Reason number 3, land value taxes are the only form of tax that doesn't change supply or demand. Now, this may just sound like some theoretical economic property.
Au contraire, because the example he just gave is that the result of people being forced because of the land use tax, the land value tax, to develop their land efficiently would produce a surplus of housing. And therefore, it would bring rent down and it would bring the prices of houses down. It would solve the homelessness problem.
It's actually very important also from a practical standpoint. So assume for a moment that you have a car dealer who's interested in selling a car for a minimum of $10,000, and on the other hand you have a consumer who's interested in buying a car for a maximum of $15,000. Now in this case, the deal will obviously go down and the car will be sold for some amount between $10,000 to $15,000. However, what if you put a tax on all car transactions? So let's say you put a tax of $6,000 on all car transactions. Well, in this case, in order to still make a profit, the car dealer will now require not just $10,000 but $16,000. And so in this scenario, the deal will not go down because now the car is too expensive. Economists refer to this as deadweight loss, and something that happens with most taxes. The higher the tax, the more transactions will be lost because of the tax, and this is then basically a deadweight loss. This is where land value taxes come into play, because there is no deadweight loss when it comes to land value taxes. And why is that? Well, think of it for a moment. Let's look at the supply side of it first. If you were to put a tax on land, then the supply would not change. Supply is basically the land that there is, and there will not be more land or less land if you were to put any tax on land. And similarly, if you look at demand, well, the land will be worth just as much whether or not the tax is there or not. And so in the end, here you have a tax that actually doesn't have any deadweight loss. In other words, doesn't affect neither supply or demand. When you consider all of these positive things, it really makes you wonder why land value taxes are not a part of all tax systems in all countries. The reason is, of course, that land value taxes do have some drawbacks. The biggest challenge is determining exactly how much a given piece of land is worth. Several methods have been proposed to solve this issue, but it still remains a non-trivial question. Another thing to consider is that land value taxes could potentially have a very big impact on people's personal finances. Consider, for example, that the average Danish homeowner has a debt of more than $100,000 due to their mortgage. Having such a high debt is only possible because they on the other side have a safe investment in the house. However, if you put a high tax on land, then suddenly the value of their house would drop, but they would still be stuck with their high mortgage. And so if you implement a land value tax in practice, you have to be very careful not to be too disruptive of the current status quo of society. So with all of this in mind, what do you think? Do you think the pros of land value taxes outweigh the cons? Feel free to let us know by posting.
Well, that's a good question, and I would recommend you go to Brit Monkey, Mr. Beat, and Nicolaj and Simon Talks for more information about Georgism. Fair use. Thank you guys for allowing me to share your videos. Very much for joining me here on this Sunday morning. I just wanted to plant a little bug in your ear, right? Put a little idea in your head about land use tax or Georgism and what the ultimate effect would be. Imagine if we returned to a time when housing was affordable and land was affordable because people who owned it were incentivized not to hoard it, and which would bring down, because of supply and demand, which would bring down the prices of housing. Imagine being able to buy a house and pay for it during your lifetime. This is something that maybe our great-grandparents enjoyed, but we no longer enjoy. So that's just an idea I wanted to throw out there, exploring Georgism. Thank you for watching me. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go out and enjoy the rest of this wonderful Labor Day weekend with my son. And as always, I want everyone to stay kind, stay blessed, stay healthy. And I will see you on the next live. Peace.
Gold label quality BiomedRx CBD Oil is made from organic hemp that is locally grown, glyphosate-free, gluten-free, non-GMO, homogenized, third-party tested, and CO2 extracted. Visit www.biomedrxcbd.com.
BiomedRx Optimum Woman is the only woman's high-potency full-spectrum multiple vitamin supplement to contain 56 nutrients, including those most important for today's woman, such as calcium for bone health, iron for healthy red blood cells, beta-carotene, biotin for nail and hair health, gamma-linoleic acid from evening primrose oil, octasanol, grapeseed extract, a potent antioxidant important for maintaining capillary strength, and vegetarian digestive enzyme. Visit www.biomedrxsupplements.com.